I'm here to introduce our keynote speakers. Okay, our first keynote speaker is Noah Hanft, and Mr. Hanft is President and CEO of the International Institute for Conflict Prevention and Resolution here in New York. He began his career as an attorney with the Legal Aid Society in New York City, and is a member of the Council of Foreign Relations. So I would like to invite Mr. Hanft to come up and share with us.
Thank you for that kind introduction, and I really enjoyed your impactful remarks. They'll remain with me. I would much rather be in a community than on an arena or in an arena. So, it's great to be here. When I first received the invitation to speak at this event, my first thought was that although I run a 501c3 organization that addresses conflict prevention and resolution, what could I contribute to an organization that strives to for peace and an end to religious and ethnic conflict? Indeed, the work this organization does is of fundamental importance to mankind, while our mission largely relates to the business community. But in thinking about it, I felt that there are two themes that at least I hope would be of interest to this audience and helpful. The first is the power of mediation. The power of mediation not only to resolve disputes, but to actually change culture. Something my organization, the CPR Institute, has worked hard on for the last 40 years to achieve. Really, what it takes to have a corporate culture oriented towards dispute prevention and thoughtful resolution of business disagreements. The second theme is to look to commercial mediation and unpack the lessons learned from CPR helping businesses prevent conflict and resolve seemingly intractable disputes, and apply them to conflict around the globe, whether it be driven by ethnic, religious, or other causes. I recently had occasion to speak to the Syrian conflict and the humanitarian crisis in that war-ravaged nation. In Syria, many attempts at mediation have fallen short. In reading about the efforts there and what went wrong, it became apparent to me that the lessons we have learned from mediating commercial disputes have application to peace negotiation efforts. Of course, the stakes are a lot higher. But just like in my career, when I came to realize that engaging in endless litigation rather than searching for solutions is nuts, choosing war over mediation is truly madness. So let me share, if I could, what inspired me to believe in the power of mediation. I was general counsel of MasterCard for almost 14 years. I'm sure many of you have heard of MasterCard. We're pretty well known. It's a global company. Its products can be used in more countries than Coca-Cola is sold. I came to the company as a former trial lawyer, frankly with a litigation mindset. But after years of observing the impact of destructive litigation, and which brings expense, fractured business relationships, I became convinced that there truly had to be a better way. I learned that mediation was that better way. I learned mediation could help resolve almost all of our major cases, whether they be commercial disputes, employment, antitrust, or any other matter. I left MasterCard 3 years ago to become the CEO of the International Institute for Conflict Prevention and Resolution. Now, what is it that drove someone who was general counsel of a publicly traded Fortune 500 company to join CPR? CPR was founded 40 years ago by general counsels seeking better ways to address business conflict. They had soured on litigation. They wanted to find ways to preserve business relationships and seek interest-based rather than rights-based solutions. CPR is a think tank, a solution-focused organization, which has over 500 mediators and arbitrators around the globe. One of the first things CPR did when it came into existence was create a pledge. It's commonly referred to as a CPR Pledge. And basically the pledge was adopted by the Institute to reflect the commitment of signatories to find solutions to business conflict apart from litigation. It's a non-binding document that is nothing more than a moral commitment to consider mediation and other alternatives to litigation before simply running to court. Perhaps the most important rationale for the pledge was to address concerns that seeking or suggesting mediation was a sign of weakness. Interestingly, concerns about displaying weakness through mediation has application, I've learned, beyond commercial disputes, as apparently similar concerns played a significant part in the breakdown between negotiations between Qatar and Saudi Arabia. As I understand it, by indicating that the Saudis made the first proposal, peace proposal, Qatar was conveying that this indicated weakness on the part of the Saudis, and this led the Saudis to bring the negotiations to a complete halt. As the New York Times reported, the Saudis were, quote, insulted by the suggestion that they had bowed first in the dispute. Now, CPR has been preaching for decades that mediation or suggesting mediation is anything but a sign of weakness. In fact, it's a sign of strength and self-confidence. Today, over 4,000 companies have signed the CPR Pledge, and the pledge has now been recognized by companies and institutions around the world in the commercial dispute resolution field. Now, we at CPR have not only focused on spreading the gospel about mediation in the United States, but our efforts have been around the world, focusing on countries that lack the foundation necessary for mediation to be successful. It's all about culture and capacity, and accepting culture and capacity means trained mediators. So recognizing that there was an extraordinary need for this in Brazil, which, as many of you know, is an extraordinarily difficult environment, both in terms of corruption and litigiousness. In fact, in Brazil, I've learned for every 2 Brazilians, there's more than 1 lawsuit, and that's including children. Its corruption challenges are massive, and it had a lack of trained mediators. So CPR embarked on a multi-year effort to help relevant stakeholders in Brazil understand the benefits of mediation through holding congresses and training many mediators, and thereby creating the capacity for mediation to take hold. So Brazil's got a long way to go, but we are recognized as the organization that has brought mediation to Brazil. Now, when it comes to driving culture change in corporations, that is one of the most important roles that we play. The traditional approach to disputes was to view disputes as battles and litigation as war. The pledge sought to change that, but even more important than the pledge was companies coming to the realization that a litigation playbook is totally flawed, and that a thoughtful approach to addressing disputes would really derive significant benefits. This led to the introduction of the early dispute resolution programs and early case assessment. What this means is companies understanding that if they can understand what a dispute is about early on and address it in a thoughtful way, they can actually avoid conflict and save massive amounts of money. This resulted in improved business relationships, significant financial savings, and one thing that is often not realized is the appreciation of the investment community. One of the things that shocked me when I was at MasterCard is we'd have this incredibly difficult case, and we mediated, and we'd have to settle a case for what I thought was an excessive amount of money. And my concern was, based on a loyalty to the company, that settlement would drive the stock down. But instead, after announcing a settlement and issuing a release, the stock would go up, because the market values like stability and predictability. So that's just one of the many benefits of a mediated resolution. Also, the amount of business disruption that occurs during litigation. So there's no question commercial mediation can save money, lots of it. But at least as important is that it can preserve relationships. I've seen how cross-cultural mediation, conflicts between companies in different parts of the world, can bridge differences and lead to better understanding and ultimately fewer conflicts and disputes. The impact goes beyond bilateral relationships. A company that recognizes the inevitability of disputes and focuses on prevention and solutions can truly gain a competitive advantage and at the same time experience an improved solution-oriented culture. I'll mention one example. One of our members, a company that I'm sure many of you have heard of, but not necessarily in a positive light, Monsanto, was involved in a massive industry litigation, intellectual property and antitrust, involving billions of dollars. One of the senior attorneys at Monsanto came to the CEO and said, essentially, this is crazy, this has to stop, we have to find a better way. So what he did was, he convinced the CEO to go to the CEOs of all the major companies, DuPont, Bayer, and the others, and said, let's sit down and try to come up with a relationship-based approach to avoid these disputes. And using our processes and CPR mediators, they entered into a series of agreements whereby they were able to resolve all of their litigations. But more than that, they were able to discuss cross-licensing. They were able to agree on not disparaging each other in the press. And these are competitors coming together, but one of the things they did was they got the Department of Justice involved to make sure that their agendas were not viewed as anti-competitive. Really well done. And this actually resulted in the industry going to zero litigation, and Monsanto actually reducing dramatically its litigation expense, and actually changed the relationship not only in that company, but throughout the industry. So this is a good time for me to turn to how the lessons learned from commercial mediation can actually, in my view, help inform mediation efforts directed at bringing peace throughout the world. The bigger the stakes, the more challenging efforts of mediation can be. And efforts to resolve the conflict in Syria have proven to be no exception. In addition to a number of ceasefire efforts, there have been 2 publicized attempts to resolve the underlying dispute in Syria. Both failed. The question has been posed whether more positive results could have been achieved if the mediation was handled in a different way. The International Peace Institute's 2016 report supports the view that some of the classic mediation problems or mistakes were encountered and realized by the mediators. For example, the report noted that there were key parties that were missing from the mediation, a lack of inclusion of necessary parties, a cardinal error in mediation, problems with the timing of the mediation, and concerns, and this is really important, about the impartiality of the mediators. Now, much has been written on how to break impasses and how to take emotion out of the mediation process, and each mediator has his or her own style. But if there are some key contributors to a successful mediation, and I'm going to mention some of them, and I believe they apply to commercial mediation as well as negotiating a ceasefire or an end to conflict. Picking the right mediator. You need a mediator that has impeccable credibility and experience. Obviously, he or she has to be viewed by all parties as impartial. A good mediator must have powerful listening skills, a relentless pursuit of solutions, patience, thick skin, diplomatic skills and cultural sensitivity and awareness. Now, on the timing issue, a good mediator knows that the timing of the mediation is critical. It can't be too soon, where too many open issues exist, but it can't be too late, where the positions of the parties have become entrenched. Getting the right people to the table. To the extent possible, you also have to keep the wrong people away from the table. Ensuring that all sides are represented and people at the table have authority to resolve a dispute. They have to have that level of authority. You need to get a sense of who the influences are and who are the best partners to negotiate with. Who are the ones that are most likely to embrace an interest-based resolution? Who are the ones that are not likely to get their egos in the way of finding a resolution? One example I'll mention was one that I handled at MasterCard. There I managed many negotiations and mediations. Probably the most important was a series of mediations aimed at resolving a bitter, long-standing dispute between the merchant community, the financial institutions, and the credit card company regarding merchant fees. The confidentiality of the mediation process actually constrains me from going into too much detail, but I'll make a few general observations as to what worked, and then hopefully that'll be of some value. In that case, the mediators earned the trust of the parties, and they did this first through individual discussions. They didn't rush to have a collective or joint session. They met bilaterally with the parties to establish relationships and engender trust. They focused on resolving early on some of the smaller, bite-sized pieces so they could create an environment of trust and the beginning or the evolution of solutions. There were disparate groups on each side, often with conflicting views. So the mediators spent a great deal of time managing negotiations with each side to get them aligned. They waited, as I said, to introduce joint sessions until an environment of some trust was created. They used a variety of techniques, including humor. They took every opportunity to move the discussion away from who's going to win in court and who's going to lose, away from legal advice or legal rights, to what the parties cared about, beyond money. What was driving them? What were their paramount interests? They evaluated their representatives to see who amongst the large group were the ones that were reasonable, transaction-oriented, and had enough influence to play a constructive role. Now, this case had consumer impact, so they encouraged both sides to think about what would be the impact of a settlement on consumers. So it was about how to, this case was actually about surcharging at the point of sale. So it was about how to introduce the power, the right of a merchant to surcharge, something that they were seeking, without without damaging the goodwill of all the parties. Because if you think about it in a credit card transaction, the card is actually issued by a bank to a consumer, accepted by a merchant, and the credit card company stands behind the card. So you have a lot of players, and each of them should really care about what the consumer impact is. So I hope there's time for questions, but I do want to conclude by saying that I recognize that negotiating a peace agreement is very, very different than a settlement agreement between businesses. There are enormous external influences in the Syria dispute and understandable massive mistrust. But I believe in reading about the efforts to date, taking into account what works in mediation, starting with a mediator who's viewed as truly neutral and ensuring that the right parties are at the table, I believe that it certainly can't hurt to take into account the lessons from commercial mediation. I want to close by mentioning that just a few weeks ago, the importance of the mission of this organization was reinforced to me in a very personal way when I detoured from a business trip to Warsaw to see the concentration camps at Auschwitz. The monstrosity of the extermination camps is chilling to confront in person, but most important, it was a stark reminder to me that genocide, driven by hatred of religious and ethnic groups, continues today, and that it's the responsibility of each and every one of us to do everything in our power to strive for a more peaceful and harmonious world. Thank you very much. I'm sorry.
I guess we have a few minutes to take some questions. Anybody?
Good morning. I'm Michelle Washington, and my experience is in developing countries in Africa and MENA, Middle East and Northern Africa. And one of the questions that I wanted to pose to you is how can, when we have commercial enterprises going to developing countries, particularly in my experience in Africa, how do we use mediation in advance, whatever that's called, to avoid what happens, whether it's in Nigeria, whether it's in Kenya, where you have resources that are being developed, and oftentimes you have conflict that results as a result of commercial enterprises going into the countries not fully understanding or connecting and speaking with the communities in which they're being involved. So I'm wondering if you all look at that in any way, and how can we use your organization's skills and et cetera to avoid this?
I think it's a great question, and obviously I think education plays an important part. So when you have folks coming into a particular environment, having them really understand the culture, what really drives people, and what's important to them. Just to analogize it to the commercial environment, one of the programs that we're working on is, when two companies get together and form, let's say, a joint venture, there's a real history of failure. I think the results are over 60% of joint ventures between companies fail. So one of the things we're trying to do, and I know I'm not precisely answering your question, but hopefully by analogy, what we're actually trying to do is introduce in the very formation of that entity or that joint program, dispute prevention techniques, and using ADR, alternative dispute resolution, thinking processes, and even neutrals, mediators, as part of the formation, as part of the structure of a joint venture. So that when I was involved in joint ventures in my prior life as a general counsel, there was always technology committees, regulatory committees, product development committees, any number of committees, but never a committee that focused on avoiding disputes. And really, you can't truly avoid disputes, but you can actually identify them early and mitigate them. And to me, that's the future. It's actually the future of alternative dispute resolution in the commercial world as well. How do we really get ahead of disputes? And companies, I think, that are very forward-thinking are actually saying, if we could understand what is actually upsetting our customers and understanding what the concerns are and address that early, we can actually turn understanding potential areas of disputes into a competitive advantage. So I really think it's about finding ways, whether it's business or otherwise, to really kind of get ahead of disputes. Think about the problems that are going to ensue in any relationship, whether it's business to consumer or whatever the construct is, so you can find ways to mitigate disputes and avoid them kind of becoming full-blown conflict.
If I can just try to make a comment, your idea is in the creation of the community itself, you build in a discussion or conflict management section or venue already. I think what's raised here is you have communities which are already existing, which is, so the communities are already there without such, and how do you build them in afterwards, right? That's
well, part of it, I think you both have touched on background being corporate as well. There's something called corporate culture. And that idea, when you go into different communities, there's a community akin to a corporate culture already. So when you form the joint venture, as you spoke about, understanding different cultures when you go into the communities.
Right.
And then you look at how to avoid it, any conflict in advance. So although my experience, again, is looking at the oil industry in Africa, diamond, whatever, the World Bank, and understanding in advance, when you go into the communities, having a healthy respect for the differences. It doesn't make you better, doesn't make you worse, it's just a difference. So how do we build that into when corporations, particularly the Western ones, going to developing countries, understanding that there are different communities, different cultures, different values, and building into that process a way to avoid it from the beginning, because if not, you're going to have conflict. You're going to have war. You're going to have this.
So you need that from the inception, that discussion, and it's both sides.
Yeah,
the ability of both sides to understand where the other side's coming from.
So sometimes there are values which already exist in the community, which are being neglected by all sides.
Yeah.
And
that's it.
Then the other piece to the question, and one of the things we'd love to do, I mean, we're unfortunately a resource-constrained organization, we've been able to go into Brazil and we're looking at other jurisdictions, but it's really the training of mediators and understanding how mediation works. It's been brought to my attention that in the Middle East, there's very few trained mediators. There's a real dearth of understanding of mediation. So it's about culture and capacity, and I think there are so many parts of the world where that is desperately needed.
Okay, and this item is Brooklyn. And this question was really a very good one because I live in a neighborhood that is gentrifying, and I am every day among ordinary people because I ride the bus and the subway. And a lot of the discussion is they don't respect us, they don't respect our neighborhood, the buildings that they're putting up, don't look anything like the ones that were there. And it seems like that they are only money driven. These are the developers that are coming in. But at the same time, the government seems to have no interest in including the community that's there, and the community can only get more enraged. So it seems to me that if profit is the only motive for people coming in to make a change, you're going to have conflict. You're going to have conflict. That's all.
You get people without the background coming in.
And not caring about the background. Their motive is profit. They don't care.
So talked about intractable disputes. Obviously that's a real challenge, but I will say this. I think that there are a lot of people that are moving into neighborhoods. I would say the gentrifiers. Some of them are good people that are not driven by the same kind of profit incentives that like the big builders are. So when you think about organizing the community, I would think about those that feel that the community is being torn apart, align with those that are coming into the community, but understand the sentiment and have sympathy for those that were living in those communities is the way to go. It's a little off topic in terms of my background, but I think it makes sense. I think the more you can create alignment between all the folks that are living there, the stronger the message will be to the mayor's office and the other powers that be.
You can create over the TV or some kind of general culture which people begin to buy into. But I'm concerned about the time.
Professor Lerman,
do we have time for one more?
One more.
Okay.
Thank you.
Good morning. A couple of observations. One with regard to culture on this issue of development and change. A related skill set for mediators, and one possibly for the practitioners of CPR and some of the more forward-thinking corporations, would be to facilitate conversations at the community level, much like some developers do now in urban neighborhoods before they put up a new apartment house or hotel. Oftentimes they'll have a community facilitation or a series of them in order to have that buy-in that's necessary. And there has to be some flexibility with the project. But that's analogous to the early ADR efforts that you were talking about. And we still have a little bit of ways to go in the traditional legal culture, because there's a concern that in litigation, if you don't do full discovery and take all those years, that, there's still a desire to win. Whereas at the table, it's not about winning necessarily in the same sort of way. So I just throw out those observations as one to respond to what you were talking about.
Yeah, we actually sometimes use the phrase redefining winning. So companies actually think about, it's kind of like the law firms that are involved with us. I get questions from the press. Why would a law firm support your organization? Aren't you going to drive down their litigation budgets? But they understand that companies more and more are thinking about solutions and looking at disputes not as the start to a battle, but a way to actually kind of move commerce and grow business rather than being in the litigation business. They want to be in the engineering business or the agricultural business.
So you bring the mediator, brings the skill set, brings the teaching, something like that. Oh, there's just one more, I'm just concerned about the
Right,
time.
no, just one quick comment though. With respect to the coming into the community, one of the things that I found is that you have to be prepared to know how to effectively participate. Because if you go into the communities looking for participation and you haven't pre-trained or advised a community, they can't effectively participate because they don't know what the issues are, they don't know how to speak on the issues or the matters.
They do need to train, absolutely.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
I'm going to correct that more and more schools, at least in the United States, are teaching something like this, which would be very, very useful. Yeah,
Thank you. Thank you.